Hello and welcome to HR Kitchen. I am David Hutchens, and I am coming to you from the United States, from Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States of America. Nashville is the home of country music. It's the home of Jack Daniel's whiskey. So we are known around the world for our good Tennessee whiskey. And we're also known for our stories. Tennessee is a rich storytelling culture. We tell stories through music here in Nashville. If you're familiar with the country music industry, Johnny Cash and Elvis and even Taylor Swift is from Nashville, Tennessee. So we're a strong musical storytelling culture. And today, I'm going to share with you some ideas about stories that you should be telling as part of your leadership. Because my job is to work with leaders around the world and to help leaders find and tell their stories. And so I help big companies tell stories about strategy and about knowledge and learning and about their brand. And I help technology and science leaders make their complicated work easy to understand. So that's the focus of my work, and that's what I do. And as I work with leaders around the world, and we're telling organizational stories and innovation stories, there's a question that comes up very often from my leaders. And the question is, they'll say, "Hey, David, should I tell stories about myself?" I mean, it comes up a lot. There are stories, about things that I do. Should I tell people those stories? And I think that's a good question. I think that's a fair question because it is true that as a leader, the stories you tell should be more we stories rather than me stories. Most of the stories that we tell as leaders are about the success of the team, or even better, the success of the customer or the client. So it's true that we don't tell a lot of me stories. And yet, there are times when you should tell stories about yourself. If you're a leader, or if you're an entrepreneur, or even if you have just graduated from university or college and you're interviewing for a job, right? You should be telling stories about yourself. And so I often will work to help them find and tell these stories about themselves. I even have an online program I've created called When the Hero Is You. Because sometimes you are the hero. If you are interviewing for a job, the job interviewer is going to ask you questions and expect you to talk about things that you've done. Or as you are growing your own leadership within your organization, there are times you should be telling stories to let people know what you care about, what you're good at, what you do. Because if you don't tell these stories about yourself, then nobody's going to tell them for you. So you should be telling these stories. So this is an active webinar. I'm going to share with you some really specific ideas to help you begin identifying and then telling certain kinds of stories about yourself. And so you have hundreds of stories. You have thousands of stories. You are made of stories. Your brain is nothing but story and narrative. And so a lot of leaders are stuck in selection, the selection piece. Which story should I be telling? Well, let me help you with this. Let me see if we can, since you have so many stories in your head, let me see if we can narrow this down. And I'm going to share with you some of the stories you should be telling about yourself as a leader or as an artist, a creator or entrepreneur. And so to begin finding these stories, first we want to identify, well, who are we and what is the value that we bring to the world? And so this is, I call this the superhero value statement. This is where you define a statement about who you are in the world and how you show up in your work. And it says that it's a simple template that you can complete. I am a blank who blank brings certain value for a certain audience. so that there will be something different in the world as a result. And so your first step is to begin crafting this superhero power statement, this value that you bring. So if I were to fill out this statement, I might say, hi, I'm David Hutchens. I am a former advertising copywriter who now works in leadership development. And I help leaders tell stories. And the group that I work with is senior leaders in big organizations all around the world. And this can be leaders in technology, in science, in consumer products, in every kind of organization. I help these leaders tell stories so that they can create engagement and belief and even inspiration in their most important work so that people will act. So that's my superhero power statement. I'm a former advertising copywriter who now works with senior leaders to help them tell stories to their markets, to their customers, so that they can create engagement and belief so that people will act. So the idea of this statement is that when you craft this and when you identify the elements of the statement, it should sound pretty specific. It should be a statement that other people probably can't say. Most people can't say. I mean, I don't know too many other former advertising people who now work in leadership development and tell stories. There might be a few people like that out there, but not a lot. So this statement differentiates me. This statement makes people go, oh, that's interesting. You're different. Tell me more about that, right? Now, one challenge with this statement is that it's not memorable, right? I mean, if I asked you to repeat back the statement that I just said to you, I bet you've already forgotten a lot of it. And that's the problem with data and with information like this. It doesn't stay in your brain. And this is why stories are important. We want to tell stories about. And this statement that I just shared with you is not a story. We want to find stories about this. So each element of your superhero power statement can be the beginning of a story that you want to tell. So our next step, after you've created your own superhero power statement, is to begin finding the stories that go with each part of this statement. These are the really good stories you should be telling about yourself. So the first one, I am a blank. And I just shared with you, I'm a former advertising copywriter who now works in leadership development. So tell me a story about that. And a story is, it isn't data. It's not a statement. It's something that happens to people. So you have stories like this thing that makes you special that you've identified. Tell me about a time someone recognized that this was who you are. Maybe it was a teacher or a leader who said, you're interesting, you're different, right? Or maybe it's an origin story. Tell me how you came into this role. What was the first thing that happened that brought you into this unique world of doing this work? Tell me about a time you discovered you were really good at this. I remember when I was in grade school, a teacher said, wow, you're really good with words, David, and that really made an impact on me, right? So tell me a story that says, it's not that I just took this as a job, it's I've long time that this is my value. So let me tell you one of my identity stories, because I have stories like this. So I actually began my career in Atlanta, Georgia, working in big advertising agencies. I was a copywriter, so I used to write radio commercials and TV commercials for big brands around the world. And I loved the work. I loved the creative part of the work, but I was spending 60 hours a week writing about things that I didn't care about. I was writing about hamburgers, and I was writing about dish soap, and spending many, many hours writing about products that did not make me excited. And so I became frustrated in my work as an advertising copywriter, and I knew that I wanted to write. I knew that I loved the creative process, and I knew that I loved influence, but I wanted to write about things that I care about. I knew I wanted to write about leadership and innovation and teams. But I didn't know how to do that. As a young guy, 22 years old, I didn't know how to change careers. And so a friend of mine said, hey, David, there's an organization called American Society of Training and Development. And they're having their big conference in Atlanta this year. And you should go to that. Those are the people who are talking about leadership and innovation. Those are the people who are talking about the things you say you're excited about. You should go there. And so I did. I bought a ticket to the International Exposition of the American Society of Training and Development. And, at those big conferences, there's always a big hall, a big room with lots and lots of booths in it. Lots of training companies showing their new technology and their new training programs. And I was a young guy. I didn't know how to sell myself. So I went to this expo hall, and all I had was my advertising. These ads that I created. I had this physical portfolio that I carried around with me. And so I went from booth to booth of these training companies, showing them advertisements that I had written. And I would say, could you use this kind of thinking in the work that you do as a learning expert? I mean, it's really kind of naive, right? I didn't know how to sell myself. Maybe that was a strange way to do it. And most people didn't pay much attention to this young guy with a bunch of advertisements. But one guy did. And it was a gentleman, a learning expert from IBM. And he saw something that he thought was interesting. And he said, that is an interesting way to think. I'd like to invite you to come visit me at IBM, and let's talk. And that began a relationship with IBM, one of the biggest technology companies in the world at the time, where for the next 3 or 4 years, I created training programs that were highly engaging, that were story-driven, using the same techniques of advertising. And that's how I came into this work. And I still, in some ways, think of myself as an ad. But now, instead of selling consumer products, now I help leaders move ideas through organizations. So that's my identity story. That's my origin story. And sometimes I tell people that story. That was kind of a long version of the story. You can tell the story in a long way, or you can tell, I also have a 30-second version of the story that goes really quickly, depending on the context. But when I tell people that story, they go, oh, wow, that's interesting. You bring a different perspective into this work. You've been doing this work for a long time. I can see this is who you are. And it's very persuasive and very effective at helping people understand who I am and what I do. So that's the first one. That's the first story that you can tell. The next part of that statement, if you recall, was a story about who and the value that you bring. So here's some questions you can ask to start to identify what are some stories you have. What does it look like when you're doing the good thing that you do? So tell me about the most amazing example of a time you brought. As we get good at doing the things that we do, we make a lot of mistakes. Tell me a learning story about a time you messed up and now you know something you didn't know before. And this makes you even, these failure, these mistake stories can make you very credible as a leader. Or tell me about a time you got a recognition or an award for doing the valuable thing that you do. Or tell me about a big idea that you had that changed how you think about the work that you do. I have stories about this as well. Let me tell you a short version of one. So this idea of bringing stories to organizations. One group that I worked with in Atlanta was the Coca-Cola company. One of the greatest consumer brands in the world, right, is Coca-Cola. And they were on a journey to create an organizational transformation. But the problem was everybody was confused by the theory behind this change. So there was a body of theory called organizational learning theory, and that they were becoming a learning organization at Coke. And the problem was nobody at Coke understood what that meant. So I wrote a crazy story, a story about a flock of sheep that outwits a pack of hungry wolves. And in the process, they become a learning organization, and they show all the capabilities of organizational learning. And then I brought this crazy story with cartoon illustrations to a publisher after Coke gave me permission to do so. And this strange cartoon story ended up going all around the world. It's translated into a dozen languages. 250,000 copies of this book called Outlearning the Wolves. And that was the thing that made me say, what is it about story that seems to engage leaders all around the world? But that's still what I do, is I tell stories to help people understand complex issues. So there's another value story where that helps you understand one way it can look when I do what I do. You have stories like this. You might be thinking, well, I'm still young in my career. I don't have good stories like that. Sure you do. You have great stories about that. Maybe stories about a time you were on a team in college and you made a big difference in a project. And if you're saying, well, I want bigger stories and I want better stories, start with the stories that you have. And as your career advances and as you grow, you're going to get new stories. And you're constantly bringing in new stories. This isn't work that you do one time. This is constant. It's like standing in a river. It's fluid. New stories are always happening to you. They're always coming to you. And when you've got a good one, grab it and say, oh, that's good. I'm going to tell people this story about who I am. Let me give you a couple. So tell me stories about the audience that you serve. What does it look like when you're getting these results? What are the problems that you see customers or clients having? Tell me about a time, the best example of how your audience saw some transformational outcomes. Or tell me about a time you felt proud of an audience or your client or your customer. Tell me about the craziest experience you had with one of your clients, where you worked with them and you experienced change together. So now you're telling stories where you've actually brought me into your work. Now I'm able to see what it looks like when you're delivering the value that you deliver. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to give you another example of one of my stories, but you have stories like this. So finally, give me some outcome stories. So these are result stories. These are results that show me what it looks like when your work is alive in the world. So tell me about a time you got great results. This is a, me at my best or my work at its best story. Tell me about a time that you were surprised by the power of the outcome and what you learned. Or once again, I'm a believer in telling the learning stories, the failure stories, the times that I had a big opportunity and I worked with a big client and I didn't get the results that I wanted. And I was and I learned something from that. Now I know something I didn't know before. When you tell these stories, some leaders are afraid to tell these stories. They're afraid that if they tell these stories, they lose credibility. But think of the leaders you know who tell these stories of failure and recovery and learning. Do you trust them less? I don't. When I hear leaders tell those stories, I trust them more, right? It makes me think, oh, good, they understand what it's like to struggle. I feel like when I fail with this leader, I can talk to them about it and we can learn together. These are very powerful credibility building stories that you can tell. So, those are 4 examples of some of the stories that you can be telling as a leader. And so when I work with leaders, a big part of my work is helping them find and then tell these stories. It's an activity called story mining. Story mining. So the 4 stories that I just shared with you, what I might suggest is that you grab a piece of paper. Let me go back, not yet. You grab a piece of paper and you start jotting down some ideas. You don't even have to tell the whole story yet, but start with a identity story. look at my prompts on this slide and think, do I have stories like that? Just capture a few notes. Think of as many examples as you can. And then a value story. What is it that I'm good at doing? What's the thing I do that other people seems like they struggle with it. It comes easily for me, but other people struggle with it. Well, that's value that I bring. What are some times you did that? Copy down a few ideas. Likewise, copy down a few audience stories. Oh, there was that time that I worked with that big technology company in Germany. We got some really good results. I should tell people about that. I should tell people about the pharmaceutical company here in the United States where I was just in this meeting last week. That was a great meeting. I should tell people about that, right? So copy down these story ideas that you should tell. So one thing I'd like to share with you is I've developed a resource that helps leaders like you tell these stories. And the resource is this. It's called the Leadership Story Deck. And so this is a deck of cards. It's a box of stories. There's dozens of ideas of story types in here that as a leader or as an entrepreneur, you should be telling. Stories about the work, stories about the client, stories about yourself as a leader. Dozens of cards in here, dozens of stories you can tell. And the thing that is exciting is that now I am partnering with Artune to create a Russian language version of the Leadership Story Deck. So for those of you in Russia who are watching this webinar, soon there will be a Russian translation of the Leadership Story Deck. But if you don't speak Russian or you don't need the Russian version, this is available on Amazon.com. You can buy one today. And so when you open the Leadership Story Deck, again, it's loaded with story cards. So here's an example of one of the story cards. So you can see up at the top of the card, there's an example of a story type. This is one of the stories you could be telling. This one is called A Leader with Conviction. There's a reason I'm here. Well, we just talked about this story, right? This is the identity story. This is the story I told about quitting the advertising business and going to American Society of Training and Development, right? Tell me about the thing that brings you here. Why do you care about the thing that you care about? So you can see up at the top of the card, there's a description of the story type. Then if you were to create your own version of this story, well, here are some prompts. Follow these 5 statements and it will help you create an effective version of this story. Then if you flip the card over, on the back of the card, there's an example of somebody telling this story. And this is interesting because what will happen is as you go through the story deck and as you go through the cards one at a time and you're getting ideas of some of the stories that you want to tell about yourself, sometimes you'll go, oh, wow, that's a really good story. But I don't think I have a story like that, right? And so if you find yourself feeling stuck, if you find yourself thinking, I don't have a story like that, well, okay, flip the card over and read the example. These are all true stories other people have told. And an interesting aspect of story is that when somebody tells a story, it triggers more stories in your brain, right? You've experienced this. If you've gone out for drinks with friends and somebody tells, and then somebody else at the table goes, ooh, I have a story like that. You go, oh, no, I've got a story like that. And pretty soon everybody's jumping in with the story to tell, right? Stories trigger other stories. Simply reading the story on the back of the card is likely to trigger a story for you. Simply reading this story, you'll go, oh, wait a minute. That happened to me as well, right? And then so give that a try. It's really interesting how that works. And so whether you use the Leadership Story Deck or you simply take notes while you watch this webinar, the next step would be called story mining. Identify as many story types as you can. So if you use sticky notes or a piece of paper, so the identity story. Don't write the story yet, simply give it a title. So as you're reflecting, you'll go, well, there was the time I quit the ad agency. and I went to that learning conference. Oh, good. You just thought of a story. So I would write that down on a sticky note. And I'd say, well, there was the time that I joined the Young Entrepreneurs Club in college. Okay, good. That's another identity story. Or I remember the first time I did a program in Europe. That's another great identity story. So copy that down. Go for quantity. Get as many stories as you can. And then later, begin developing those stories so that you can tell them. So those are just a few ideas for you. This construct that I've shared with you, which is your superhero power statement, and then finding the stories that go with each element of the statement, this is available to you as a handout. So I can share with you it's the information that I shared in this webinar, but all on a single page that you can print and you can do your own story mining. So if you will send me an email to david@davidhutchens.com, I will send you a copy of the story mining sheet. Artum has kindly offered to create a Russian language translation. Again, I know a lot of our audience for this webinar is in Russia. So if you're Russian, I can also send you a Russian version of this document. And finally, if you are interested in learning more about storytelling and about the stories that you should be telling about yourself, or the stories you should be telling about your team, or about your organization, or the stories of innovation, the stories of leadership, the stories of transformation, of winning in the marketplace. There's lots of stories you can be telling, and this is the heart of my work, is helping leaders find and then tell these stories with impact. Come on over to my website, davidhutchens.com. There's lots of resources there. You can learn about the books that I've written, about the programs that I deliver in America, in Europe, in India, in Asia, even in Moscow and Russia, all across the world. I help leaders find and tell their stories. Lots of ideas for you on my website. Thank you for joining us here at HR Kitchen and for your attention, and I hope that you will live a great story of leadership that other people will want to tell. Thank you very much.